Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Happiness Index. My name is Phelan, and I'm here with Betty. How are you doing, Betty?
Yeah, very well. Thank you. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm really, really looking forward to getting into this subject today. The working title tool that we've got is embedding equity into the workplace and AI. And Betty and I planned this podcast before the summer, but actually, it think is even more relevant than when we planned it. So I'm really, really looking forward to getting into this today. But Betty, could you just introduce yourself, please, and just tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Bertille. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, and so in my work life, I spend time, thinking of kind of strategy and what action can we implement to create the condition of equity and equal outcome for everyone. And then I suppose I'm French. I live in the north of England, where it rains a lot. That's it mostly.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So, Betty, in terms of you obviously specifically mentioned the word equity and creating that. What would be if we work in a world with lots of HR practitioners who really understand what equity means. But if you're meeting someone from outside of work and you say that you work in equity, but they don't know the space, how do you explain it to someone?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I went to a conference where someone just put it in a very simple way, and I thought I just love this because if you think about it, so like a building ramp, that's equity. That's just making sure that everyone has access to a building, everyone has equal outcome. So that's just very simple, actually, for me. It's just making sure
Yeah,
there's fairness for everyone. And
yeah,
I think it's really important to really simplify the word because I think it confused people. So think of
yeah.
equal outcome, I think is the best way.
Equal outcome and fairness would be your two ways that you'd explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the word fairness because I think it's something anyone can get behind, isn't it? It's like it'd be hard to find someone that doesn't want fairness. I think
Yeah.
that's a really beautiful and as you say, sometimes equity gets confused with like financial equity and so on. That's what I see people going down different roads on it. So thank you for making that simple for us. Um, Betty, so we can get to know you. The most important question we have for you today is what makes you happy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this time of the year is brilliant for me because I do a lot of foraging and I live obviously in the Pennines. So I spend the weekend looking around for a beautiful little edible mushroom. So this is what makes me really happy. It's just collecting things in the nature. It's just finding a great way to relax, take time away from work or everything. So yeah.
But that is, I like to think that I would be that person who does that, and I like everything about that. But how do you get? I know we're going off a tangent, but how do you get started? It's because everything about that is like what I would love, but have I ever done it? No chance. But how do you get it started
I
in
mean,
something like that? But
it helps when you live near a forest, but we've always done that. So in my family, we've always collected edible mushroom. So I kind of know some very well. And then locally, I did some foraging course to just know what's around me here because obviously it's a bit different. I guess that's the best way. Just do a course or go with someone who knows a few things. It's probably the best way.
have that of course and go with somebody who knows some stuff. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Betty. So before we get into equity, there is, I think, a couple of elephants in the room that we need to address that come up a lot. And one of them is very political, which is in the US, ED&I has come under a lot of pressure politically. And I've been to conference is where people have worked in this area of ED&I for maybe 10 years. And some of them are saying that my whole career, everything I stand for is almost being outlawed or pushed to the edge. We can't really start a podcast without addressing it. What do you think of the political pressure for ED&I as a group to go away? That's probably how the best description I could of what I read. What's your thoughts on that, Bertie, as someone who's really passionate about this area?
Yeah, so I mean, we've definitely seen different things. I think, there's been I think some company who reframe what they do a lot, particularly in the US. There has been some company who actually have said we're not going to do this anymore, and I think that's been very interesting for their employees, because that's a very interesting message to hear. If suddenly this is not something you care, particularly when those companies may have had very strong statement about it in the past. So um, that can send mixed message, particularly, I've read definitely certain things where it makes it harder to sometimes for people to hire, or some people have left those organizations as soon as they could because they're like, well,
Yeah.
if you don't feel my identities welcome here, I'll go somewhere else. And I think there's been some organization who, they're doing what they were doing, but they're not talking as much about it, which also sends a message. But I think they're trying to like carry on. Um, so there's a lot of mix. There has some company who've been like, absolutely not. We are gonna, carry on with what we do because this is about employee. This is about belonging. This is about making sure that you know we have equal outcome. Back again to that word. So there's a mix of things, and I'm sure that that will carry on. Um, in the field where I worked, this was when I started working in advertising, and there was an interesting one where a a particular organization wasn't given the right to bid for a project with Transport for London because they said they were going to pause some of their EDI activity, and so they were taken out of the kind of the process for procurement. So, there are some organization who's standing some ground as well. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to see at the time.
Yeah. We had, if people can scroll back to this, Andrea Calendar, who's the Inclusion and Diversity Director at Alexander McQueen. We had her on for an episode, and her reflection over the last 3 or 4 years is that we would, her view was that there were a lot of people that were trying to solve the right problem, but her reflective view is that we went down a route that didn't make people feel included, which her point was, ironically, a move for inclusion didn't include enough people, was her reflection. But please scroll back and listen to her actual reflections, because that is me paraphrasing. What do you think on Andrea's point on that, Bertie?
I think there's a really interesting moment of reflection, at least for our community, into what we've been doing, and the thing is also, sometime as a practitioner, you can be pushed to doing things that are very visible, so you can talk about it, you can apply for these awards. My perspective on this is rarely what you're going to achieve the real change, and so I would, I mean, I haven't listened to that particular podcast, but I would probably agree with the way you paraphrase it, that actually we really need to have a rethink into how we approach this work, what we are there to achieve, and have those, difficult conversation as to what we are going to do and what we are going to stop doing. So I think there's a value in this, when there's a moment like that, I think there's a value in doing a bit of introspection into the work you've done, and
Yeah.
making sure it's fit for purpose. So there's an opportunity here, I think, for the
Yeah.
community who works on this topic.
And the final point, because we do want to get into the subject today, but we do think it's important. I think for me, one of the reflection points is data and research. And I think one of the studies that was quoted heavily by the community was the McKinsey diversity research. And Alex Edmonds from LSE did some research on it. And again, I'm going to paraphrase it. The main points he came out with were correlation, not causation, weak selective evidence, lack of statistical significance. And I think Alex's point is strong research is needed, as opposed to just jumping on something. It was his point. And I think my reflection point when I look back is just the power of data and the importance of making it robust, so that when people get behind stuff, it can't be as easily picked apart. What do you think of Alex's views on that, Betty?
Yeah, it was very interesting for me because I've always been very uncomfortable with the notion of a business case. I don't
Yeah.
use this at all in my kind of practice. And actually, if people want to read something interesting on the business case, I would point them to Fearless Future, which they've done a lot of work on deconstructing that particular argument, because there's many flaws in it, but I think I really agree with the point around correlation and causality on the same thing, and
Yeah.
obviously checking the sources and all of that. But there's also something really weird that just the representation should lead to a better outcome. Well, if you don't have the right condition, that doesn't really do anything. It goes back
Yeah.
to the idea that you can have people who represent all kinds of identities and community, but if you don't have psychological safety and, a way for people to have a voice, feeling safe, we're not going to achieve that much. And these people will probably go. But I think
Yeah.
also there's something a bit weird that it's a bit, there was always a bit like something dehumanizing in this, in the sense that, your male representation should be only there because you're bringing more profit, just because you're there. It doesn't really make sense to me. It's like it's something really weird. I think I reread the report that they did at Fearless Future, and they call it like this magical extra value. And it was like, well, how does that work? So I
Yeah.
I would really agree with that. But also I think there's a risk of putting people against each other, and going back to your point around, making sure we bring everyone along with this piece of work around inclusion and belonging. So there's many flaws with it, I think, with the concept of business case, and I don't think we should be using it. So the fact that that study was also questioned, um, is is very pertinent to me.
Yeah. I think for me, the key is just more data on what's going on. And I think the part of the problem with a lot of these studies is they set out with the goal that they want to achieve.
Hmm.
Whereas if the goal is actually just to observe what's going on and report that back, if that's useful for any community, just to say this does exist, it doesn't exist. This is what we've observed. So thank you for addressing those two, Betty, because I didn't think we could get into this without discussing politics and research. So Betty, you explained to us what you mean as equity, right? And that fairness word came out really strong, and I love the image you created of the ram. And you're obviously passionate about it. From a work perspective, the phrase that when we had our pre-call you used is embedding equity. So the question I've got is, what does embedding equity mean in your work, especially in HR and creative fields?
Yeah, of course. Um, First, I would go back to the word passionate. That's another one I don't really use, because
Mm.
I sometimes worry that the word, people they say, oh, I'm very passionate about, diversity and equity and inclusion. And for me, it's like, well, it's actually a very specialized field that has, particular skills, and, we need to understand like change management, power structure, all this sort of thing. And to me, I don't really define myself as passionate, but this is what I do. This is,
Yeah.
my role, I suppose. And sometimes I think the word passion can lead some people who, they're interested and they want to do some change, and that's great, but they don't necessarily have the knowledge about how, and so we need to make sure they do. That's the
Yeah.
just a tiny point here on that. And then I suppose, if we take, you talked about like the HR part and the creative field, so there's kind of two things I think for me, but it's always I go back a lot in my work around, what's our process and our structure, and are they objective, fair, measurable? And I think if you take those principles, you can apply that to everything, and that creates a condition of equity and equal outcome. So if you take a hiring process, let's say, it's like, okay, how are we actually hiring people? So is it measurable, fair, and objective? Um, then you can really bring people along, because actually, well, who would be against the idea that they are being selected on those three ground, as opposed to, maybe some, vagueness, potential bias, or just connection. I think people want to be recognized for, their skills and what they know, and that, um, so so that's kind of the way I approach it. It's always with these three pillars, and it's very about the structures and the process, which is much harder. Let's just be honest about that, because then you have to really dismantle sometime what we do and change it, and you have to bring along people with this idea and explain to them why we're going to do that. But also sometimes you have to let go of very things that are very ingrained. If you take hiring, what we know, interviews aren't the best way to hire people. We know that there's loads of research on this, but somehow it's really hard to let go or change that to make it more measurable, more objective, more fair, or use other method. All these different things. So sometimes, yeah, there's a bit of a challenge there, I suppose. Um, that's kind of, for me, one of the example I would give, but you can apply that to all the different, part of the employee life cycle. Again, you assess performance. Okay, how do you do this so you mitigate the issues of bias, particularly recency bias, or things like that. And then again, you make it fair, measurable, objective. And I think that's where the work of a D&I practitioner is really there. And that's also a really good way to going back to the argument against this work to counteract those arguments. Like, no, we're trying to make sure everything is set in a way that ensures equal outcome. And it does mean that for certain groups, you might need to do certain things because the level playing field isn't there. So like, for instance, I'm partially deaf. So if you have caption on calls, great. That will help me because I might miss some bits. Brilliant. But that's like the way to achieve fairness. So you may still have some things that are for particular groups. I'm not saying we want, but the idea is still going back to that kind of process. And the thing is, I've always called that like the non-sexy part of my role because it's much harder, it's much harder, it's much deeper, it takes more time, it's much harder to put that in an award or talk about it all the time, it's less visible. So, but it's where the impact is.
Yeah. And I must say to our listeners, I added the word passionate in because when I spoke to you, you come across very passionate about the subject. But I also personally do think that's probably why you're good at your job. But that's a total side point. But that's where that word came from.
No, that's fine.
And Bertie, you said and this is where I really want to keep drilling into this word fairness because, again, this is an area I believe in. But like one of the things that ends up in like Daily Mail articles and is used to criticize it is where, and this is the podcast was about before, where people feel excluded from that. For example, the one that I picked up was Furlong versus Chief Constable of Cheshire Police found Cheshire Police guilty of discriminating against a white heterosexual man, but by denying him a job, etc., etc. So these are the other things that end up people hearing about, isn't it? Where there is a process in place where people don't feel included in it because they feel that they're getting excluded. But what you're actually just talking about is just making sure that everyone has an equal chance in an interview process, as an example. How do you feel when you read articles like that? Because you see that sort of stuff all the time come up, saying, well, this is making it hard, blah, blah, blah. And then people feel excluded and so on. How do you feel about that sort of thing, Bertie?
I mean, first, there's a bit of a sensational things to make sure people click. Let's just, address that bit often.
Yeah.
And then I guess the deeper part here is, to me, what I would want to be able to say is actually, well, the way we've assessed the person, we are confident this was fair, objective, and measurable. And so, I think I think that's the way to counteract those arguments where you see them, and then just making sure. So then it's about everyone, and I think that's the bit that we need to go back to. We need to acknowledge that there are systems in our society that mean some people don't have access to equal outcome. We need to address that.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that the way then we bring along people is, for everyone. So this is those two tensions that are constant in this work. And that's where the data is so important, because then you can go to the data and say, okay, we've noticed this, and being I think there's also an issue of transparency often with this, is that being very clear, okay, we've noticed this particular group, for instance, doesn't have access to our industry at all. So we really want to make sure people have access, they have equal outcome. We want to level the playing field. So we are going to do certain steps to support that community. But when we assess then their entry to our organization, it would be assessed against, the same for everyone in that kind of, fairness. I mean, it might not be the same, because that, for instance, someone with a disability might have different needs, and we need to address that. But, it's kind of the principle that you would want to use. And then you can be able to say, this is, but there's the transparency. I think that's really matter. And I think sometimes it's lacking with these things.
I just want to capture those 2 points there of transparency and data, because I think, Betty, you're making a really powerful point, which is I went to a HR event in the last couple of weeks. I'll try and change the story a little bit to keep the identity of the people. But there was a senior leader in one of the organizations that was there whose child was working in the organization. And many of the HR professionals at the event were like, oh, I can't believe this person has hired their child into the organization. And it started a really interesting conversation around whether that was right or not. But if you have in place what you're talking about, then that person who's been hired can feel comfortable that they have been hired in a fair and transparent way.
Yeah.
Because the problem is that there was an assumption straight away that this was unfair. But there's two sides of it as well. I also kind of felt sorry for I was going to call them a kid. They weren't a kid. They were just younger than me. And I always think everyone's a kid that's younger than me, but they're not. But I also felt sorry for that employee who was at the event, because I felt like they may have gone through a fair process. There may have been data there. And that's what you're saying, isn't it? Which is that the process and the data needs to be there. So anyone who gets hired, whatever their characteristics are, they can feel pride in the fact that I got this job fairly. Is that the point you're picking out here, Bertie?
Well, yeah, and I think in that case, you would want to make sure that that process is spotless, because otherwise there's this risk of thinking, okay, well, because of the relationship, this has led to the hire. And actually, I don't think the individual in question would want that. And I also don't think the organization would want one. So you'd want something really spotless, how do you assess skills? How do you probably in this case, you would do a lot of, blind kind of assessment. So just
Yeah.
making sure that, yeah, there's no potential risk there. I mean, the thing is that, yeah, there's always going to be something, is that person will have more knowledge of the organization just because they've got a connection. And that's a
Yeah.
much harder point to address. And I think, and that's where all the stuff that, organization do to bring knowledge of their organization to communities that have less access. So we do some work like that, where I work, where we bring people who don't have access to the creative industry to talk about what we do, to make them excited, to also some scheme you provide mentors so they have access to that knowledge. So, but that's the level playing field part. They still will be assessed on the same criteria, but they will have had access to that knowledge, that because of,
Yeah.
where they come from, they don't. So you need both. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to go. This is a really the next question is a really tough one, because it's so relevant at the moment, Bertie. Which is, you talked a lot about AI and bias when we met. Can you give examples of how AI might accidentally cause unfairness? Like, for example, in the hiring example that we used.
Yeah. There's many potential pitfalls with AI, and the opportunities, and I guess that's the thing with technology. There's always both. So with AI, there's some risk around how the data was trained, and we know that, and that's not just for hiring. That's just across the piece. What source does it use? And I found it fascinating, like when I do some research, and I use AI to do some of the research I do for my work. Sometimes I'm just like questioning the source. I'm like, can you clarify where this come from? Is it a reliable source? And then the thing comes up with, oh, actually, no, it's not that reliable. It's not quoted anywhere. I'm like, okay, well, maybe don't give that. But so just, and also, you know, there's some initiative, for instance, to decolonize AI, because the models are based on very historical data and the human bias. So there's all of this that kind of goes in the mix. And then there's another element to me as well, which is where the transparency I think there's a really big important part, which is to tell candidates, are we going to use AI to select them? I think, not telling people creates a bit of an issue where we're asking people to spend quite a lot of time writing, application. And also we may look people down if they use AI to write their application. Obviously, we want people to be able to think. But, if you're asking AI to make your CV nicer, why not? I don't think there's an issue with that. But then we're not telling them that actually that's going to be some of the tools we're using. So I think there's something around kind of the relationship you're creating with your applicant. That's quite
Yeah.
important. But the bias is more, where was the, how was the model trained? And actually for some AI, it's really hard to even question that, because it just gets quite complicated. And also they come from a private organization, which might not want to tell us all of this data. So
Yeah.
there's a big risk to reinforce systemic inequities with using AI in recruitment. Yet, if you have the right model and it's been trained properly and it's been trained to address unfairness and all of this, maybe we can also do things where we counteract the human bias. So there's kind of the risk and the opportunity with this.
Yeah. I think, again, back to your point on transparency is key here, isn't it? The one, your example where you use your CV to look better is one that I think about a lot, which is I didn't go to school in a period where I was diagnosed with dyslexia, but my wife's a teacher and she's pretty convinced that I would be if I was at school today. But I've obviously learned and adapted to work through that. And the one that I think about a lot when people talk about whether a child uses AI, whether you use AI, is something so common is spell check because spell checker came in, but like whilst I was at school, and I just think like some of the basic opportunities that I managed to get myself, I probably would have got nowhere near without spell checker. And
Exactly.
I'm so reliant on it. I think about that a lot when people use AI to maybe organize their thoughts or ideas or creativity. So I just wanted to add that into if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think again, it depend how you're using it. I think, I mean, I do read a lot about AI, and I have a friend who's super keen on AI and ethics, so she's feeding me things, which is brilliant. But it's around like making sure it's used to use your brain, and it's more like a partnership, I suppose, where it brings you, some research you might not know. It might help you summarize something, but just again, being mindful of that. Has it picked up the
Yeah.
right thing? But if it's used first to think, then that's where it impacts your cognitive capacity. So have a look. There's some MIT research on this, which are fascinating. Um, but your point is around the spell checker to me is like, well, again, this is like level the playing field because actually some people are great at spelling, some people are less. It could be because of a different condition, or I'm French, so my spelling is varies. So I use a spell checker a lot, and so I think this is fine because I'm not, but unless I was being hired to spell check, which I don't think I should be, but otherwise I'm being hired to embed equity in our system.
Yeah.
This is less relevant. I can use a spell checker
Yeah.
to manage that. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Betty. Just going on to the third question. You mentioned that some diversity initiatives aren't very helpful. What are the problems with these, and what do you think works better to create real equity?
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, and I think as a DNI practitioner, like every profession, there's things you're going to try that do really well, and then things will be like, oh right, okay, no, didn't work, didn't do the outcome we wanted. And I think back to the psychological safety. Well, learn from your mistake and have the safety to do so. That's kind of probably the first point. But for me, it's not so much the initiative isn't useful, but sometime, and particularly recently, because there was more spotlight on DNI, is that I think a lot of the profession was pushed to do things um that weren't really achieving what we needed. And I read a really good podcast from Bina Condola, and he talked about the best practice and the common practice, and they're very different. And I think there's been potentially a tendency to use the common practice. We're all doing these things, but actually, are they the best practice what we achieve? But for instance, um, you know, I think the question is always going back to like, what is the real problem here? Um, and so, for instance, you might have data that a certain group don't advance their career. Okay. So you think, oh, okay, well, let's do a program for that particular community to advance their career. But there's a few flaws in that. Is that actually what's the real problem? Is it the individual that's the real problem, or is there some systemic issues within our business? It could be racism, it could be disableism, it could be, all of these things. Okay, so actually, what we need to address is these issues, not the person and that community. And so then
Yeah.
also, so it's the root cause. And also, what I don't like often with those programs is they're based on a deficit model. So there's something wrong with you as a community, and we're going to fix that. And that means you will progress. But that doesn't work
Yeah.
because we haven't fixed the system and the structure. So you might get some people moving up, and and you'll be like, oh, brilliant, we've some people have moved up. But you need to think about it as an ecosystem where actually we need to work with our leadership and our structures and our processes. And yeah, possibly we'll have to work on readdressing an inequity for certain community because they haven't access to that particular skill, that particular mentoring. But if you don't think about it in a holistic way, it won't achieve that much. And so then you'll hear those headline, these people got put through these program, and and I didn't, me, because I didn't come from those community, and I feel left out. And actually also the program's not really achieving what we want. So it's kind of if you want to create equity, you really need to equity proof the process.
Yeah.
And then think, okay, is there a particular community where actually because of systemic problem, we need to then do certain initiative. But again, it's less visible. So it's harder to convince people that's what we need to do. It takes more time. But then to me, again, it'll go back to the fairness piece, the transparency. So, it's all these different elements that actually achieve change, but it's
Yeah.
much, much harder.
Oh, it's interesting when you were talking about looking at the system rather than like an individual project. I always think about London as an employment area quite a lot, Bertie, when this conversation comes up, because there's a lot of people who don't live in London have a lot of opinions about what London is. But the reason I live in London is because it's an absolute creative melting pot of people uh, and ideas and backgrounds and everything from around the world, which makes it such an exciting place to raise children. And one of the systems that doesn't work is getting people and children through local schools into businesses in London, because London has some of the biggest organizations in the world, but it just doesn't, that system doesn't work somehow, because you just don't end up with the people from this melting pot in the companies. It just doesn't happen as you walk around. Like when you're ever in an office in London and you ask, you can point at any tower block or anything and just say, is anyone employed within a radius of this organization? And I just do it as a test sometimes. It's very unlikely that anyone will come out in some of the biggest organizations that they live locally, unless there's someone from quite a wealthy background that might have an extra flat or something in the area. But that is something that I think about. I think about that system, and I think that somewhere that system isn't working because the people that live locally that need the opportunity are not getting that opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating. This is definitely something we talk a lot with, because so the office where I work is in Liverpool Street. So obviously, you got these amazing community on our doorstep, and it's how we make sure that they feel, this is a place for them. And also because it's the creative industry, and some people don't always,
Yeah,
think about it as a career, because sometimes they actually don't know the breadth of career that could be in those industries. So there's a lot of work to do there. But
yeah,
also for me, is going back to, to the creative process, is how do we include those community in some of our creative project? Obviously making sure that, if we're getting their knowledge, we're compensating them. That's essential to me. But, how do we do this sort of thing? And going back to the point about London, though, there's something really interesting, because there was a Sutton Trust report about mobility recently published, and they did talk about that around, where are the hot and cold spot. And actually, it was very interesting for me, because if you're in London, even if you're in some of the most deprived area of London, you often still do better. Obviously, it's like a general statistic than if you some of the other cold spot in the country,
yeah,
around Manchester, around Leeds, around Wales and that sort of thing. So there are some things that sometimes we need to make sure we don't forget, because they have even less opportunity, and particularly social mobility, and around Newcastle, particularly I remember
yeah,
reading. So, but so there's some work to do in those communities as well, if particularly for business who have a present.
yeah. And I suppose the reason I brought it up is it just made me think of your point around the system. There's something in the system's that's not working. I'm not going to make you the mayor of London for this next question, but it would be a good framing of it. But you believe in a strong framework is important in this area. What are the key parts of a good framework? If you're looking at a system and you're thinking, right, I want to change the system, what framework what needs to be part of a framework to address something like that, Bertie?
I think, I mean, first assess it, and again, you may have some data, you may not have a lot of data. If you don't have your own, do some research about, what's happening in the industry, or, all of that. I just always think you need good data, but in some organization, we're more or less lucky on what we get. And I don't think that should ever stop you from acting. That's the first thing. And then the framework, well, it should always be based, what are your core principle? So, here where I work, we talk about conscious inclusion, which is about deliberate action. And we talk about, the objectivity and the measurable and the fairness. And I bring that all the time in my work. They're probably really tired of hearing me saying that. But it's kind of how do we structure things? So, and I think also with all these process, if you want to remove the issue of bias, try to take away as much as possible where there could be subjectivity. For instance, if you talk about performance management, well, a lot of places they do objective and they review them every year. You might be a bit more lucky where they do that a bit more often, but that's not the experience I've seen in a lot of places. But actually, and I think that's where, all those automation in tool could be super useful is you could have, little reminder, can you write down some objective fact about what the colleagues achieved in the last 3 weeks or that sort of thing. And so then when you come to review it, you have all that kind of really rich data, potential feedback, and it also there's the recency bias, which is an issue with performance management, for instance, was when you remember you only remember what happened recently and you don't remember what happened last kind of November. Um, and so, actually having those points, those nudges. So that's another thing I use a lot in the way I work is nudges for behavior change. So how do you prompt people to kind of, oh, okay, yeah, oh, I forgot about this. Okay, let me think of that. Just getting their brain thinking regularly that they need to implement that fairness and that inclusion and the equity piece. So those are kind of the things I would use. So the assessment, also what's your core principle, what are you trying to address, so where's your data telling you, and then how do you make it more systemic and almost less that the person need to overthink it, so it's more regular and in a way it might be simpler as well for people than actually having those big meeting where they're like, oh gosh, I can't remember what happened and I need to draft these goals, and goals will evolve all the time, so it's really important to review them as well.
Yeah, so important. Bertie, have you got, when you've done one of those reviews, can you think of an example of how helpful that was? We talked about the reflective moment for the community at the beginning, but have you got like something where you thought you did that review and thought, oh, do you know what? We do need to course correct, or we do need to change, or we do need to adapt. Have you got any examples on that?
um Yeah, I mean, both last few places I've worked on loads of work in hiring and exactly that, trying to kind of really move us away from just kind of CV interview chat kind of thing to much more, okay, what can we test objectively, and also reminding people the test isn't like, okay, it's done, that's it. But actually think about all the data you're going to gather about the individual and then make your decision on your own and then compare with the others. So those sort of things really can drive some change internally, but it's kind of also letting go of some method, which yeah, can be tricky.
Thanks, Bertie. Time is flying. We're on to the last question already. Um, What are the biggest challenges we face to make sure AI is used responsibly and ethically? I mean, I thought you had some hard questions
Yeah.
before, but this is an even harder question. But
Yeah, and also, obviously, I'm really interested in this topic, and I'm always learning. So, by no means am I one of those expert, but this is kind of, I guess, my perspective at this point. But I think one of the challenges is, and I feel this, it can feel very technical. And so because, it's really hard to understand some of these new system technology, some people might shy away from even addressing it because they're like, gosh, I don't really know what to do because I'm not a technical, I don't work in technical AI things. And so, you know, I think it can make you lack your confidence, I think, in challenging them. The other challenge is there's a bit of a race at the moment. We all need to be using AI. We all need to adopt it. Businesses really want to implement it. And sometimes I think it's just trying to think, okay, well, we do need to think, what's your core principle here? How are we going to use this? How are we making sure people using AI ethically? You know, if we're going to be generating images, are we making sure that they're not going to be full of stereotype and bias? Because if you're generating images on it at the moment, then, there's some work to do, I would say.
yeah.
And so, how are we setting those parameters? And it goes back to kind of, what's your ethical framework? Again, something to define in the business. And, another challenge is the models can be very opaque, even for the company who build them. And again, that's like, I mean, sometimes your brain goes a bit like, what? What do you mean? And so it's all these different challenges that we are going to face. But I think, it's just creating our roadmap. So, you know, if you were in HR and you're using AI, it's kind of thinking, okay, why are we using it? How are we using it? What's our core principle here? And just making sure these guidelines are there, and making sure that your partners, the partners that provide the AI also knows your kind of guideline. But there's a lot of work to do, I think, and it's moving really fast. And just equipping people with that knowledge, going back to the transparency, how their data is going to be used in training AI model and that sort of thing. That said, it's really interesting. We're using, so I have a colleague who loves building AI agent, and we have a way to do this. And you can also use it really well around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, for instance, we did a session business wide to talk about psychological safety. Just to, how do we embed that? How do we create high performing team that feels safe and all of that? And he's brilliant. He created something called the Devil Avocado, and it's an AI prompt to use in meeting to do a bit of challenge without having to put anyone on the spot to do that challenge. So you can also use it very creatively to embed the condition of equity and psychological safety, but obviously just having those kind of thinking and guardrails and all of that. So it's a bit of both. Again, risk and opportunity.
I think that's I think the key point I take out from your point there, Bert, is understanding what you're using and why you're using it, because that's what Sam Altman said, founder of OpenAI. He said there's three kind of like bad scenarios that can result in the future of AI, and I think one and two were the sci-fi fantasy one, that they start firing nukes at each other. The second one is that it turns on and we can't switch it off.
Yeah.
But he said the third and most scariest one is the really boring one, which is it starts to run our lives and businesses without us realizing, on systems that are not healthy for us. And I think that what I take from you is the importance where people are implementing it locally in their organization to understand what and why. Because the test that that I saw someone use the other day is if you take what's the mountain, what's the mountain in America where they have the four presidents on, called
Rushmore?
Rushmore. Someone was saying, like, an example of, like, if you asked AI to create Mount Rushmore, it may create it with four white men. Now, that may be based on historical, looking at the historical fact of that most presidents of America have been white men, versus what if it creates a really diverse group of people. The key isn't which one it creates, is trying to the key is understanding, why has it created the one? Has it created the all white men because it's used past data and then extrapolated forward? Or has it been coded to try and create something that looks different? But whatever it creates, the question has to be asked, where has that created that from, and where has that information come from? What has coded it to do that? And I think Sam Altman's point is, we have to remember to keep asking those questions. Otherwise, we just take everything that we see as fact. So any thoughts on to finish up on Sam's points there?
It's really interesting. Sorry, a little while ago, because I wanted to equip myself. I did a course at the LSE on AI and ethic, and it's a really good course to really question, like all of this, not just in the workplace, but for democracy. So, it's kind of, again, going back to like regulation, transparency, accountability, which is going to be really key in AI. And also, I think the piece around, equipping people about how we're using it and deciding these things is, because it's a new field, we just need to be mindful about like potential risks that could happen. And that we know there's been some issue with hiring, for instance, where there are some lawsuits about AI hires, or organization using AIs for hires, and people saying, well, actually, I've been discriminated by your model, the way it was trained. There's some issue around, there's deep ethical issue around, AI and children using it and all this. So I think it's just, going back to like, I think as a business is like, what's your ethical roadmap around it is so important. And not just using the word responsible because it's trendy, but just really deep thinking, what does that mean for us? And where is our line? We're not going to be using it for this, and we want to make sure no one ever does that, and it never goes to one of our clients using, I think it's really important, but it's every organization needed to do that, and society in general, obviously. Yeah, that's a big piece of work.
Yeah, very big piece of work.
Yeah.
So Bertie, we're at the end. I'm just going to summarize everything you said in 3 words, which is fairness, fairness, fairness. That's how I would describe um, everything in here, which is so nuanced, the conversation we've had today. So I hope people listen, they make their own mind up. I hope they message both of us with their opinions, what they agree, disagree, thoughts. We would love to hear from you. But Bertie, thank you so much for coming in and tackling what are some of the most difficult and most important questions of our time. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do that.
Well, thank you very much for this, Matt.
Thanks, Bertie.